This Clan MacPherson program is a journey of discovery sweeping through the ages. To meet with ghosts of times past, to hear their stories, to explore the ancient castles, the homes of your ancestors, and discover the roots and richness of your Scottish heritage and name. And there is no better place to start our journey than here in Glasgow, Scotland's great industrial city in the foothills of the Highlands. Today, people come from all over the world to visit this historic city. But 200 years ago, these bustling streets were thronged with people here for a very different reason. Some following hardship in the Highlands, others seeking opportunity and adventure, came here to the port of Greenock in the Firth of Clyde, where they took ship for the Americas, and later for the younger countries of Australia and New Zealand, an emigration which continued almost to the middle of this century. But wherever they went in the world, these millions of Scots took with them the heritage, the sense of history, the traditions of this, their homeland. From scenes like these, old Scotia's grandeur springs. It makes her loved abroad, revered at home. From the towering snow-capped highlands in the north, through the purple-heathered glens of swirling mist, and onto the softly rolling hills of the borders, this ancient and beautiful land of Scotland is held dear in the hearts of millions of Scots worldwide. The story of Scotland and of her peoples is as complex and diverse as the many different cultures and traditions which have merged to form this most unique of countries. Cultures which have clashed through time, Highland and Lowland, Jacobite and Hanoverian, and yet have given birth to the stirring romanticism of the Gaelic lordship of the Isles, and to the remarkable achievements of the royal house of Stewart. Our story begins over 6,000 years ago, with the arrival of the first settlers in Scotland. These early pioneers discovered a deeply forested land, brooding and impenetrable. They settled along the coast and on the riverbanks. They lived by fishing and hunting in the dark woodlands. Enigmatic remains of these peoples can still be found. But their lives and thoughts are lost to us now, kept secret in this land once called Alba, now called Scotland. The Roman legions marched into Scotland about 80 AD, and it is from their historians we have the first records of this land and of her peoples. To the northeast, the oldest inhabitants, known as the Picti, or the Painted people, whose origin is unknown to us. In the western Highlands, the Gaelic-speaking Celts, or Scoti, who had sailed from Ireland. Across the lowland areas were the Brythonic Celts. Their legends were those of King Arthur, and theirs was the magical land of Camelot. The Romans, who had conquered the known world, never managed to quell the indomitable spirit of Scotland. They ruled Britain for almost 4 centuries, but built the famous Hadrian's Wall to keep the warlike Scots at bay. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Anglo and the Saxon came to the lowlands. In time, Viking raiders came too, and with fire and sword conquered the north, east, and much of the Western Isles. For hundreds of years, Viking, Saxon, Celt, and Pict clashed in their battle for supremacy. The skill and courage of these warriors is reflected in the game of shinty, still played in the Highlands today. By the 11th century, the Gaelic Highlands won out. And as Gaelic became the principal language and culture, so the Gaelic use of surnames became widespread. They developed from 4 principal roots: from a person's occupation, as in Fierce, meaning parson; from a place of residence, as in Sutherland, from the lands of Sutherland; from a physical feature, as in Armstrong, a literal reference to a strong arm. The most popular form of surname in Scotland, however, is the Gaelic use of the word Mac, meaning son of, as in MacDonald, son of Donald. The origin of the name MacPherson is derived from the Gaelic meaning son of the parson. For a person with Scottish roots, your surname is only one clue in the search for your ancestry, for unique to Scotland is the ancient system of clans. The word clana is derived from the Gaelic and means children or family. It is used in its present-day context to mean an extended family, often, though not always, sharing a common name, united under a chief and bound together by a shared heritage. The clans practiced a sophisticated system of government which survived often independently of the rest of Scotland for nearly 5 centuries. They often banded together into great confederations. The Clan Chattan and the Lordship of the Isles were the most enduring. Indeed, so powerful did the lordship become that its power stretched along the entire western seaboard and reached inland to include much of what is now considered Highland. Few today know more about this age-old method of kinship and government than Rob MacDonald Parker of the Clandonald Centre at Armadale.
The clans in Scotland have been around since the 11th century and probably beyond that. The word clan is an old Gaelic word which means children. A closer description would perhaps be kin. The clans as we know them today are probably much later. After the lordship of the Isles collapsed in the 15th century, the families kind of broke out into their own separate branches, and groups such as the Cappochs and the Glengarrys identified themselves much more clearly under a clan chief. By and large, they lived very democratically, particularly through the period of the lordship of the Isles, where on the council meetings, MacDonald sat at the head of the table, but he was surrounded by MacLeans and MacLeods and McKinnons and other clans who equally had a part in this council. And they traded and they bartered and they arranged marriages and they passed laws and they heard complaints. And while the rest of the world would believe we were all red-haired, hairy Highlanders running out of the heather, I think there was some form of government that was quite beyond what was happening in other places. Well, the structure, of course, was the chief would be at the head, considered in the clan terms as the first amongst equals. His lieutenants, or his right hand, so to speak, would be the closest members of his family, and throughout the clan, it would descend in order of your closeness to the chief. And the way this was interpreted was the job of the Shenachie, which is the Gaelic historian. And his job was to remember all of the family descendances. And obviously, the closer you could be to the chief, the better status you had within the clan. Obviously, up until the Second Rebellion in 1745, the clans operated quite well under their clan chiefs. But after the Battle of Culloden, the whole system collapsed. And in 1746, the Prescription Act was passed by the government, which insisted that the families, the children of the chiefs, had to go south for education. And of course, they came back anglicized as opposed to being Highland. The family still comes into it. Today, I meet American clansmen, Australian clansmen, and I feel as if I've known them all my life. They're invited to my home, I'm invited to their home, and we only met each other maybe 10 minutes before, and it's just this, there's a complete relaxation and trust of a fellow clan member. I go to America once a year to speak to the Clandonald USA annual general meeting, and I'm always amazed that having made the long journey from Scotland to America, when I get there and I walk in, it's almost like I've just been next door for the last year. People say, "Hi Rob," like they see me all the time, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful relationship.
Traditionally, your clan have lived in the lands of Lochaber, but they moved to the lands of Badenoch, which had been granted by Robert the Bruce. The forefathers of both Clan MacPherson and Clan MacKintosh were the original Clan Chattan. Kenneth, the son of Ewan Ban, second son of Muriach, the chief of Clan Chattan, who lived about 1173, was the father of another Muriach who lived in Badenoch in the 14th century. It is from the 14th century Muriach that Clan Vorich are descended, and their name means the posterity of the three brethren. These three brothers were Kenneth, who fought in the great Battle of Invernahaven in 1376 and was the ancestor of Cluny MacPherson, John, the ancestor of the MacPhersons of Pitmain, and Gillis, the ancestor of the MacPhersons of Invereshie. Clan Chattan's history had for centuries been a matter of dispute both within the Confederation as well as in general terms. Much of this dispute centred on the right to the chiefship, a right claimed by both MacKintosh and MacPherson. Clan MacPherson's claim centred on the descent from the 12th century chief, while MacKintoshes stem from the fact that the 6th chief of MacKintosh married the heiress of Clan Chattan and thus inherited her right. This dispute was to surface throughout both clans' histories. This is Lagan Parish Church in the heart of the MacPherson heritage. It would seem that in 1348, the minister or parson around here was called Duncan the parson, and his son was therefore Duncan, son of the parson, or in the Gaelic, Duncan MacPherson. Perhaps Duncan MacPherson was the first of the great Clan MacPherson. The main line of the clan descended from Kenneth, the warrior of Invernahaven, through Donald More MacPherson, the son of Duncan, the parson of King Newsy in 1438. Duncan would appear to have been a person of some importance, for he was, for a time, imprisoned beside the powerful Lord of the Isles. It is a short time after this that the first evidence of the MacPhersons appears on record, and it shows them holding lands in Strathdairn and in Strathnairn. One Bian MacPherson witnessed a bond of Duncan MacKintosh, captain of Clan Chattan, in 1490. And in the Mackintosh charter chest, there is a bond signed and sealed by his son, Donald MacPherson. The seal illustrates the lion rampant, a device usually associated with the MacKintoshes and their ancestors, Clan Macduff. Later Macpherson seals, however, have the galley, a device normally associated with descent from the old Clan Chattan. Interestingly enough, in the Pitmain and Invereshie MacPhersons, a story is told that the parson from whom they derive was actually a Mackintosh, and these same families complained to the Privy Council in 1672 that they were never chiefs, and nor were their kinsmen, and that they were really descended from the Macintoshes. Whatever the truth in this matter, the chiefs of Cluny were eventually recognised by Crown and Clan as the undoubted chiefs of Clan MacPherson. The Macphersons first positively appear in Badenoch in the 16th century as vassals of the Gordons of Huntly, to whom a number of the clan under their chief Macpherson of Cluny gave a bond of man rent in 1561. The 8th chief was murdered in 1587, and 10 years later the lands were again under threat by a legal technicality. This threat was avoided, though, by the timely intervention of a prosperous kinsman who was a merchant in Edinburgh. Andrew Macpherson of Cluny, who held lands in Strathisla, fought under the 6th Earl of Huntly at Glenlivet in 1594 when he defeated the royal forces of the 7th Earl of Argyll. The most important factor in the development of Scottish culture, and ultimately the clan system, was the advent of Christianity, brought to Scotland in the 6th century by St. Columba. Columba was an Irishman, a Celtic prince of the Aeneas and a most remarkable man. To atone for the blood he had shed as a warrior, he became a priest and chose to exile himself as a missionary in Scotland. He arrived in Dalriada in 563, just at a time when the Christian Scots had been crushed by the pagan Picts. Nevertheless, the hero Columba penetrated far into northern Pictland, converting the Druids to Christianity, and, it is said, quelling a monster he encountered in Loch Ness. Then he came to Iona and founded its monastery. Iona became an important ecclesiastical centre with contacts throughout Europe. The spirit of Columba can still be sensed here on the hauntingly beautiful Isle of Iona. The monastery remains a place of pilgrimage and great spiritual power. The shared Christianity of Celt and Pict created an atmosphere of mutual trust and intermarriage. Here once stood the ancient city of Scone, the very first capital of Scotland and the heart of its history and faith. For this is a place of kings. Here, after years of bitter enmity and wars, the Celts of the west and the Picts of the east were at last united under one high king. Kenneth MacAlpin, of mixed Celt and Pictish blood, was crowned king in 842. When Malcolm Canmore was crowned King of Scotland 200 years later, Scotland had become firmly established as a nation-state. Despite the rule of a single king, the clans maintained their own independence. There was much feuding and bloody warfare. The Earl of Huntly devised a plot for setting Macpherson of Cluny against the MacKintosh chief, who was also chief of Clan Chattan, as he was getting too powerful for Huntly's comfort. It was suggested to them that as the Cluny MacPhersons could claim descent from the old line of Clan Chattan, while the MacKintoshes could only claim their right through an heiress, Cluny ought to be regarded as the rightful chief of Clan Chattan. It was a cheap trick, but one which was quite worthy of Huntly, for he himself had inherited in similar circumstances to the MacKintoshes. The ensuing debate lasted for centuries, and Macpherson was at one time granted arms-in-chief of Clan Chattan by the Lord Lion. This decision was reversed when Mackintosh complained bitterly, and Lion rewarded them the Clan Chattan chiefship, at the same time promoting Macpherson as a senior cadet of the race. On a number of occasions from 1609 onwards, Cluny MacPhersons recognised Mackintosh as their captain-in-chief of Clan Chattan, eventually accepting the Lion Court ruling of 1672. These feuds over the chiefship of the clan greatly disunited the Confederation and turned many of its members against Mackintosh. Despite this, at the last clan battle ever fought, when the MacDonalds of Keppoch captured Mackintosh at Mulroy in the Great Glen in 1688, it was Cluny who assembled his men and set about rescuing him. Although Malcolm Canmore's Scotland was a resolutely independent nation, events further south were soon to have an impact. In 1066, England was invaded by the Normans. Within 1 year, they had totally crushed all opposition. A wave of refugees swept north for the sanctuary of Malcolm Canmore's Scotland. Among them, Edgar and Margaret, the children of the deposed King of England. When the English royal family fled to Scotland after the Norman invasion, King Malcolm fell quickly and deeply in love with the Princess Margaret. They were married soon after. It was a marriage that brought many changes to Scotland. Under Queen Margaret's influence, the Gaelic culture was slowly eroded in the lowlands. The Scots dialect of English began to replace Gaelic as the spoken language. The dress and manners of the English court became commonplace, and the Scottish church was radically altered. In time, the Normans and the Scots of the lowlands began a period of intermarriage, trade and commerce. Much land was granted to the Norman knights, who established their own family dynasties. Lord Elgin, a descendant of Robert the Bruce, whose own family was established at this time.
I think you would usually say that it was families north of the Highland line in Scotland, where a great chief, the strongest member of of a family, had established himself and his descendants, all of whom consider themselves descended from the original chief. Sometimes he was undoubtedly a figure which could be pointed out historically. Other times, I believe you might almost say that it was a figment of the imagination. But still, this feeling that every member was directly descended from the original chief. In other parts of Scotland, families undoubtedly had a close network of relationships, but I think they tended to consider their new family as equally as important as the original one. And in the case of my own family of Bruce, many of the junior branches of the family have been immensely distinguished and are entirely separate, as it were, in their way of thinking, and could not be considered in the same way as Highland families.
The great Norman families of the lowlands, newly established in the 1100s, were to play a major part in the growth and development of Scotland. England became fearful of this developing strength, and in 1244 launched the first of many invasions. For almost a century, the opposing armies clashed violently on the battlefields of the border. This warfare brought Scotland to the brink of disaster. The death of the king, Alexander III, in 1286, plunged the country into chaos. All seemed lost until the emergence of a new leader, Sir William Wallace. Wallace led an ever-increasing band of independent Scots into battle against the English, and with an ad hoc army, vastly outnumbered, he achieved victory after victory.
Here at Stirling Bridge, in 1297, the patriot Sir William Wallace routed the English army. King Edward was so incensed that he came to Scotland himself, and for 2 whole years harried Wallace and his followers. Finally, in 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and brought to the Tower of London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Edward's dream of a Scotland subject to the English crown was almost a reality. All that remained for him was to place his ally, John Comyn, on the throne. But Wallace's gruesome execution was not to be in vain. One of Edward's supporters, the young Scottish knight Robert the Bruce, had been inspired by Wallace's struggle for a free Scotland. In February 1306, Bruce called John Comyn to a fateful meeting in Greyfriars Church. The two men argued, swords were drawn, Comyn was struck and left fatally wounded at the altar. Bruce was forced into the life of a fugitive, pursued across the lowlands and highlands. Despite the impossible odds, many Scots slowly rallied to his banner. Towns and then castles came under his control. Essential to his campaign was the control of Stirling Castle. The garrison there agreed to surrender to Bruce if it was not relieved by the 24th of June. The massed armies of Edward II headed north and were in place by June 23rd. Bruce drew up his army on the banks of the Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn took place on the morning of Midsummer's Day, 1314. Bruce, knowing he had the smaller forces, chose to occupy this high land, thus forcing the English army to come at him up the hill. At sunrise, the battle commenced, but the English armour soon found itself bogged down in the marshland waterlogged by the Bannockburn, and the English archers could find no place from which to attack. Sir Henry de Bohun, one of the bravest of the Norman knights, challenged Bruce to single combat. The Scots warrior king at once accepted. In the ensuing duel, he neatly avoided the Norman's lance and, swinging his battle-axe around his head in a huge arc, cleaved the Norman's skull with a single blow. The Scots cheered and charged, and before noon, King Edward was in full flight for the English border.
14 years of cross-border raiding followed until a treaty was finally signed. Scotland had won the day, and Robert the Bruce was her undisputed king. Bruce's campaign took place during the heyday of heraldry. One of Scotland's leading experts on heraldry is Alistair Campbell of Airds, from the court of the Lord Lion.
It is a remarkable thing, but heraldry today in Scotland is more alive and part of our national life than it ever has been. It was in 1672 that the splendid series of arms recorded in Lion Office was first commenced. And in the last 30 years, there have been as many grants and matriculations of arms as there were in the whole of the previous period put together. Heraldry came into Scotland, as with most of the rest of Europe, towards the middle of the 12th century. It had three important uses. The first, for personal identification, for people who were clad in all-enveloping armour, which might well have led to an unfortunate mistake in the heat of battle. Secondly, as a means of locating leaders in the field. And thirdly, very importantly, in the form of personal seals, as a means of authentication of important legal documents in a day and age when very few people, apart from the clergy, were capable of signing their own names. To make the system work, it required control, and here we see the arrival of the heralds. In Scotland, the chief post is held by the Lord Lion, King of Arms, whose origins go back to the royal shenachie of the ancient Celtic kings, although his title in its present form is first recorded in the 1300s. In Scotland, he is Her Majesty's Supreme Officer of Honour, to whom the monarch has delegated responsibility for all matters armorial. He is also responsible for state ceremonial and is a judge of the realm with very considerable powers. Heraldry in Scotland is very firmly controlled, and as a result it's the purest system in existence today. At the outset, it must be stressed that there is no such thing in Scotland as a family or clan coat of arms. Grant of arms is to one person and to one person only. And once that grant's been made, the arms pass without further formality to whoever inherits as head of the family. Other members of the family may take out arms which are suitably different from those borne by its head. And in the same way, people of the same name, although they cannot trace their exact relationship, are given arms which are recognisably relative to those of the chief. And in this way, in Scotland, to the trained eye, it is always possible to recognise to which clan or family somebody belongs and their position in it.
These are the arms of Clooney MacPherson, chief of the clan. They're his personal arms, and of course they can only be used by him. The shield, following the tradition that the Macphersons, like other members of Clan Chattan, hailed from the west, displays the galley of the Isles on a shield divided into blue and gold. There are two other West Highland emblems on the shield. On the dexter side, a red hand holding a dagger. This red hand is supposedly the red hand of the O'Neills and denotes descent ultimately from Neil of the Nine Hostages, High King of Ireland. On the sinister side is a red cross-crosslet. This is taken to denote a connection with St. Columba, who himself was a member of the O'Neills. On either side of the shield, as is the case with the arms of a chief, are two splendid supporters, two wild Highlanders, who have thrown away their kilts and pinned up their shirts in order to allow themselves full freedom of movement in battle. Above the helmet is the chief's crest of a wildcat sitting down, and above that again the motto, "Touch not the cat but a glove." In other words, you take care before you meddle with me. This, of course, forms the insignia which can be worn as a crest badge by all members of the clan, with the cat surrounded by a buckled strap on which the motto is placed.
Black chanter of Hachton, now hushed and exhausted. Thy music was lost with the power of the gale. The dread inspiration Macpherson had boasted, forever expired in Jamossy's sad wail. The Black Chanter of Hachton. It is said that the bagpipes belonging to this chanter were made of crystal, and fell upon Clan MacPherson during a clan combat in Perth in 1396. Maybe so. But the Black Chanter is still here. Here in the Clan Museum and House in Newton Moor in Inverness. Clan MacPherson. Like the MacKintoshes and the Farquharsons, a clan of the cat. And remember their motto, touch not the cat, but a glove.
The exploits of the MacPhersons and their chief during the Jacobite Risings are well documented. Ewan Macpherson of Cluny, reluctant at first, was persuaded to join the rising by Lord George Murray. He raised a regiment of some 350 men in Badenoch, and about half of these were Macphersons. They picked up others as they made their way toward Edinburgh. Once there, they remained with the Jacobite army, taking part in its march into England and back, during which time they played a significant role in the skirmish at Clifton. They took part in the Battle of Falkirk in January 1746, where they routed those who faced them. The chief of the clan lost one of his cousins, among others, at this battle. They joined with the Athol Brigade under Lord George Murray, and clearing the government forces from Athol, they were part of the blockade on Blair Castle. The majority of the clan surrendered their arms under an amnesty in Badenoch after Culloden, a battle they had missed, being delayed en route. Cluny Castle was burnt to the ground by Cumberland's forces, and this saw the end of the rising for the Macphersons. Prince Charlie slept 12 of his last 20 days in Scotland, enjoying Cluny's hospitality. 6 of these days were spent in Cluny's cage on Ben Alder. Cluny himself remained a fugitive in his own lands for 9 years. During this time, a ransom of £1,000 was offered for his reward, which in today's terms would be a fortune. He was fed and protected by his own clanspeople and never betrayed. Cluny eventually escaped to France in 1755 and died there 9 years later. Although his estates were forfeited for his gallant part in the rising, they were restored to the family in the form of Duncan, son of Ewan, in 1784. Cluny Castle was rebuilt, but sold following the death of the 17th chief. The power of your clan, which had lived for so long under the ancient and noble laws of the Highlands, was on the wane. There are many Macphersons who have passed into legend. 2, however, deserve special mention. They were both called James Macpherson. The first was known as the Highland freebooter. He was the son of the Inverness Macpherson, and in his youth attached himself to a party of freebooters who had become famous for their habit of robbing the rich to feed the poor. The popularity of James and his band among the impoverished ensured that it would be a long time before they were captured. When Macpherson was eventually arrested, his trial made legal history. It was the last such trial under the old laws of heritable jurisdiction. Macpherson was immediately sentenced to death, but this was appealed because banishment was the normal sentence under the old law. The authorities were determined not to let their popular prisoner get away. When it came to the day of the execution, they even set the clock in the town back 1 hour. When the time came for his execution, James asked to be allowed to play the fiddle. He did this as he thought a pardon might arrive. He played for some time, but when it became apparent that no pardon would come, he broke the fiddle over his knee. The event is part of the folklore of Scotland, and the tune he reputedly played is known today as Macpherson's Rant. The same fiddle, still in its fragmented state, can be found in the excellent Clan MacPherson House and Museum at Newton Moor. The other James Macpherson was a nephew of the chief's cousin, killed at Falkirk. He is best remembered as Ossian, on account of the famous epic poems known as the Ossianic Legends. In the 200 years following the victory of Robert the Bruce, Scotland experienced a time of tremendous upheaval. The royal line of Scotland passed from the Bruce family to the Stuarts, a powerful dynasty often plagued by deceit, treachery, and greed. They sought to bring the clans of Scotland under their direct rule, to subdue the ancient Gaelic culture of the Highlands, a society based on equality, fair laws, and the code of hospitality, while the lowland system of government was feudal in nature. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Highlanders were continually harried by lowland armies who gradually won control. The age-old culture of the Lords of the Isles was passing into history. A time of great change across the entire continent of Europe, the 16th century Renaissance gave birth to the new Protestant faith. The charismatic preacher John Knox carried this new Christianity to the Scottish people, and within less than half a century it had become the dominant religion in Scotland. Spurred on by the ethos of this new religion, Scotland emerged as the world's leader in scientific, educational, and technological achievement. However, not all were converted to this new faith, among them the royal house of Stewart. Their staunch adherence to Roman Catholicism was to play a decisive role in their eventual downfall. In 1542, a week-old baby, Mary Stuart, became Mary, Queen of Scots. 6 years later, she was sent to France and returned at the age of 17 to take her place on the Scottish throne. Scotland was unprepared for her beauty and passionate nature. Her youthful charm won her many admirers and many enemies. In 1587, she was betrayed and beheaded at the command of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. However, Elizabeth died childless, and Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was crowned King James I of Scotland and England in 1603, the first monarch to rule both countries. The royal house of Stuart had reached the zenith of its power. 85 years later, it would be destroyed. Under Stuart rule, Britain was convulsed by two brutal civil wars. In the Second Civil War of 1689, James II became the last of the Stuart monarchs when he lost his crown to the Hanoverian William of Orange. He fled into exile, never to see Scotland again. The Stuart dynasty was to attempt to regain the throne one last time. In 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the exiled king, took ship from France, landing in the Western Highlands with the statement, "I am come home." Many of the Highland clans came out in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his army marched to within 150 miles of London. Realizing that no English would join him, he retreated to his Scottish headquarters at Culloden near Inverness. He was followed by an English army led by the Duke of Cumberland. The Scots were wakened at dawn on the 16th of April 1746 by the English drums and a barrage of artillery fire. In less than half an hour, all the dreams and ambitions of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his supporters had been blown away in the smoke of battle. Cumberland showed no mercy. The wounded were slaughtered where they lay, and those captured were burned alive.
With the defeat at Culloden, Charlie's year, or Blin a Charlich, as it's called in the Gaelic, was all but over. Cumberland sent out his troops in pursuit of those who had been out with Charlie. The government soldiers set fire to their houses, drove out their cattle, and laid waste to their lands.
After nearly 400 years, the Stuart dynasty had finally come to an end. For the clans, Culloden was the final crushing blow. The victorious Hanoverian government in London began to systematically dismantle the Scottish nation to ensure that Scotland could never again threaten English power. Scottish people were forbidden to wear the tartan, denied the right to carry weapons, even forbidden to play the pipes. Clan chieftains were stripped of their political status and reduced to mere landowners. In time, these landowners saw a better profit in wool and mutton and began evicting the Highlanders. The clearances had begun. The once vibrant Highlands were soon left desolate, stripped of the culture and a people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The lands they'd fought over, tilled and tended, were left bleak, populated only by sheep. The Scots have always had a sense of wanderlust, a pioneering spirit. Scots had been emigrating since the 16th century, indeed before that, often as mercenaries. But during the mid-18th century and on, they were actively encouraged to emigrate to the new worlds, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Agents toured the country, employed by the various colonies to attract new settlers. The spirit of the Scots was spurred on by the lure of adventure and the opportunity to own land that could be passed on from generation to generation. The Macphersons have long been scattered from Badenoch. However, many have achieved fame in their fields of endeavour. Edward Macpherson, the Pennsylvanian-born politician, was a member of the House of Representatives and later was a member of the 36th and 37th Congresses in the 1850s. He was the author of many political journals, as well as the author of 2 histories of the United States. He was also a much-respected newspaperman, owning and editing such banners as the Gettysburg Star and Sentinel and the New York Tribune Almanac. Another Macpherson much respected as a politician was John Roderick Macpherson, who served in the New Jersey State Legislature from 1871 to 1873 and was a member of the United States Senate for almost 20 years. Closer to home, Malcolm Macpherson was achieving fame as a piper. As a prize piper, he maintained the old Highland traditions. In 1885, when his chief Clooney Macpherson died, he composed a lament in his honour. His teaching skills were considerable, and pipers came from far and near to study under him. Malcolm also passed on his skills to his 4 sons. His youngest son, Angus, was invited by the multimillionaire Andrew Carnegie to be his piper at Skibo Castle. There he lived at the castle under Carnegie's patronage, entertaining such nobles as Edward VIII. Angus lived on to the ripe old age of 96 and was awarded an MBE for his services to piping. Scottish people have left their mark wherever they've gone. This impact is reflected in the wide variety of Scottish place names and organisations found the world over. The Aberdeens, the Edinburghs and Glasgows of the United States, the Fraser and Mackenzie rivers of Canada, Dunedin in New Zealand, the Caledonian societies and Burns clubs, and of course, the Highland Games that take place all over North America, Australia and New Zealand. For many people of Scottish descent, tracing their ancestral roots is an important way of tracing the richness of their heritage. Stuart Reid outlines some important points for the would-be genealogist.
The best advice I could give to people who are coming to Scotland to do the family tree is to find as much information as possible at home. Now, the best way to do that would be to ask their immediate family, other relatives, perhaps there's a family Bible, anything they can get. The objective would be to find a Scottish link. Now, by that I mean a birth, marriage or death that took place in Scotland. Once you'd ascertained a proper Scottish connection, that's the point to actually go to the record office or use a professional genealogist, and they would then take it back from there. Now, let's say it was an 1865 birth or something like that. There would be a copy of that birth certificate at the record office, which would take you to the next necessary step, for example, the parents' marriage, and so on and so on. It's difficult to say how far you can get back, because every case is completely different. But generally speaking, you're doing pretty well if you get back to the mid-1700s. It is possible to find living relatives in Scotland. A lot would really depend on whether they remained in Scotland and had issue. For example, let's say somebody's grandfather left Scotland. He may have had brothers and sisters who stayed in Scotland. So it is possible to see whether they had children, and so on up to the present day. So the bottom line is yes, we can trace living relatives in Scotland.
Whether you come to trace your roots or just to holiday, for the millions of people of Scottish origin worldwide, returning home to the land of your ancestors is a unique experience. Everywhere you go, and it's so easy to go everywhere, the friendliness of the people awaits you. There are no strangers, only friends you haven't met yet. Secluded villages and stunning surrounds are home to the many traditions and amenities for which Scotland is famous. Among these, it boasts the finest salmon fishing in the world. Where better to play golf than in the land in which it was invented, on the best golf courses in Europe. Whisky distilling is an ancient Scottish art, and people can visit the many distilleries all over the country. And of course, probably the most famous tradition of all, the tartan. Few in Scotland today know more about this age-old Scottish craft than Tony Murray.
The earliest documentary evidence of tartan doesn't appear until the mid-16th century. But there is absolutely no question that tartan is of much greater antiquity. It was not clan tartans as we know them today, but patterns which ranged from the very simple, that of the earliest known specimen of what some people would call tartan, a piece of cloth stuffed in a jar of Roman coins and found in the Falkirk area. It was purely a simple check of two colours, two shades of undyed wool. Probably just the product which came to hand, the clippings of some ancient sheep, woven into a pleasant dice of black and white, what today we would call a shepherd's plaid. It was not known as a tartan then. Tartan did not have names. It was not really until much later that tartan acquired names, and especially those of clans. Up until the 18th century, tartan was very much the idea of the local weaver. They ranged from the very simple, muted colours, right through to the beautifully complex designs so typical of that time. These early tartans, of great subtlety of colour, became used mainly in the form of the great plaid, the filamoa. Now, this was a wonderful garment because it was woven so finely by these craftsmen, these local craftsmen, that it was almost waterproof. Following the failure of the Jacobite Rising of 1745, tartan became proscribed for a time. After the repeal of the Proscription Act in 1782, tartan had passed from being just the product of the local weaver into an industrial context. With the rise of the industrialisation of tartan, an ethic of applying clan names to the various patterns arose, and this reached its height around 1822 when Sir Walter Scott stage-managed the great visit of George IV to Edinburgh. And since that time, tartan has become the identifying feature of a clan. Today, this tartan bears the name of Clan MacPherson, but in its very earliest stages, it was also known as Kid and Caledonia. The dress MacPherson pattern originated about 1842, but we're less certain about the antiquity of the beautiful hunting pattern, which, although undoubtedly old, cannot be placed with any certainty. From its humble origins on the looms of the local weaver, Tartan progressed through industrialisation, acquiring as it did the names of clans and families. Today, tartan is a living fabric, but it has progressed even further, for it now represents the names of great states. There are tartans for the various great states in America and in Canada. There is an Australia national tartan. It is an identifying feature of corporations worldwide and continues to develop. Long may it do so.
And when we leave the silence of the countryside, the splendour of Scotland's great cities awaits us, as we find ourselves enwrapped in the still vibrant culture of the Scot.
The Edinburgh military tattoo, highlight for thousands every Edinburgh festival, and a showpiece in the calendar of Scottish events. On the wide open spaces of the Esplanade, the pipes and drums of every Scottish regiment wait to carry the sounds of Scotland into the Edinburgh night. One has only to hear it to feel again that surge of pride in a Scottish heritage.